I can't give you my true name, not here, not now. If I did, the recognition would hit like a thunderclap, and the brittle kingdom I've spent years stitching together would collapse under the scrutiny of a million ravenous eyes. My image haunts the city, splashed across towering billboards, flickering on screens in every grimy bar, etched into the ink of tabloids that line the checkout stands. It's a face I've sculpted into a shield, a lie I wear for a world that claims me as its property. One stumble, one jagged tear in the facade, and they'd swarm like flies to a corpse, picking me apart until nothing remained. For this story, call me Shade. I'm a silhouette in the glare of fame, a marionette dancing on threads I fool myself into thinking I command. The lenses never sleep, the scavengers never tire, they circle, waiting for the blood to spill. My existence is a polished mirage, a veneer of perfection stretched thin over a hollow core, until one night it fractured, sharp and irreparable, beneath the weight of a stranger's voice. It was 2 a.m., that forsaken hour when the city's pulse slows to a sinister crawl, its neon veins dimming to a sickly glow. I was slumped on a threadbare couch in my loft, the air thick with the stale bite of coffee and the faint hum of traffic bleeding through the cracked window. My laptop glowed like a dying star, its screen cluttered with notes for a deal that could have carved my legacy into the concrete of this unforgiving sprawl, a pitch to lock and a sponsorship that'd keep my name blazing in lights for another year. I was half dead, eyes burning from hours of staring, when my phone erupted, its buzz cutting through the silence like a chainsaw through flesh. The screen was a black hole, no name, no number, just an empty slate that stared back at me. Every instinct screamed to let it die, to shove it under the cushion and pretend it never happened, but some festering itch, some masochistic pull, dragged my thumb across the glass. The voice that oozed through was a venomous thing, slick and cold, a dagger wrapped in velvet that sank into my ear and twisted. Shade, it purred, my name a curse on its tongue, I've got something you'd kill to keep buried. Pictures, nasty, intimate little snapshots. You, stripped down, caught in the act with someone you thought you could trust. My heart lurched, a wild beast slamming against the bars of my chest, claws raking at my ribs. The room tilted, the shadows stretching into claws of their own. What the hell are you talking about? I snarled, my voice a ragged edge, but the words drowned under his tide. 50 grand, Shade. By Friday. Wire it to an account I'll drop you, or these beauties flood every festering pit of the internet, every forum, every sleaze site, every corner where the vultures roost. Your shiny little world? It'll be ash by sunrise. The line cut out, a guillotine dropping, leaving nothing but the echo of my own ragged breathing and the hammer of blood in my temples. My hands were traitors, trembling like leaves in a storm, fumbling with the phone as I clawed into my cloud storage, that digital crypt I'd trusted to guard my secrets. The loading icon spun, a mocking dance, until the files bloomed across the screen, phantoms of my past, frozen in pixels. There I was, laid bare, skin glistening under dim light, entwined with a figure whose features blurred into a smudge of memory. Moments I'd lopped away, raw and reckless, snapped in a haze of booze and trust one didn't know I'd misplaced. My gut twisted, a sick coil of nausea rising. I tasted bile, sharp and sour, burning the back of my throat. If these escaped, it wouldn't just torch my career, it'd flay me alive, peel back every layer until I was nothing but meat for the masses to chew on. My name would be a punchline, my life a public execution, a sacrifice to their endless hunger. Panic sank its teeth in, a feral thing gnawing up my spine. Who was this parasite, this shadow with my soul in his grip? How'd he slither past the walls I'd built, crack open the vault I'd bolted shut? The cops were a joke, leaks poured from them like sewage, and the press would smell the story before I could blink, turning my ruin into their headlines. Friends? I didn't have any worth the name, acquaintances who'd scatter at the first whiff of scandal, or worse, peddle the tale for a quick hit of cash or clout. Colleagues? They'd smirk behind my back, knives already out. I was a wraith in my own story, a hollow shell pacing a cage with no key, the walls closing in tighter with every shuddering breath. Then a name punched through the fog, Silas. My stepfather. He'd been chained to my mother for 5 years, a towering figure carved from shadow and steel. We weren't close, our exchanges were cold, perfunctory nods over tense dinners, but I'd seen him bend the world to his will. Money flowed through his veins, connections spidered out from his fists, and his mind was a blade honed to cut through chaos. If anyone could crush this nightmare, it was him. But turning to Silas was like baring my throat to a wolf. The clock mocked me, 3:30 a.m., but I knew he'd be awake, lurking in that cavern of a study he called his domain. The house was a tomb, silent except for the creak of floorboards under my bare feet as I crept toward his door. It loomed ahead, black wood scarred with age, the brass handle icy against my palm. I shoved it open, the hinges groaning like a warning. Silas looked up from his desk, his slate-gray eyes pinning me where I stood. A tumbler of whiskey glowed amber in the dim light, papers scattered like a battlefield around him. "Raven," he rumbled, voice a low growl, "what's dragging you in here at this hour?" I stepped inside, the air thick with cigar smoke and menace. My pulse was a drumbeat in my skull. "Unfucked, Silas. Someone's got dirt on me, bad dirt." He tilted his head, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit. Tuck." The story spelled out, jagged and raw, the call, the photos, the blackmailer's noose. I didn't hold back, my voice splintering as I laid out the threat. Silas listened, stone still, his face a mask of shadow and calculation. When I ran dry, he leaned forward, elbows grinding into the desk, fingers laced like a cage. "Any idea who's got the guts to try this?" he asked, his tone flat but laced with a predator's edge. "No," I said, hating the tremble in my voice. "I don't even know how they got in." He studied me, a hunter sizing up a wounded deer, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll deal with it." Relief surged through me, hot and fleeting, but his next words snuffed it out. Silas's lips twitched into a smirk, sharp as broken glass. "You get that nothing's free, right, Raven?" My insides nodded. "What's that mean?" He leaned back, eyes glinting like whetstone. "I'll bury this rat, but it's gonna cost you. You ready to pay up?" I wanted to run, to scream, to claw my way out of that room. But I was sinking, and Silas was the only rope in reach. "I don't have a choice," I muttered, the words bitter as bile. His smirk widened, cold and triumphant. "Good answer. Leave it to me." "But Raven," he leaned in, voice dropping to a hiss, "you're mine now." I staggered out of the study, legs jelly, mind a storm of static. Sleep was a stranger that night. I paced the dark, questions gnawing at me like rats. Who was Silas beneath the suits and swagger? What kind of man could snap his fingers and erase a threat like that? And what had I just chained myself to? Dawn broke gray and heavy, and Silas was gone, my mother mumbling about some early errand. I didn't dig. I couldn't stomach it. The day dragged, each minute a weight on my chest. I smoked through a pack, stared at my phone like it might explode, paced until the floorboards groaned. Then, as dusk bled red across the sky, Silas stormed back in. He found me in the kitchen, a shell of myself, and jerked his chin toward the study. "Move," he said, voice a whip crack. I followed, dread a lead ball in my gut. He slammed the door shut, the sound ringing in my ears. "It's done," he said, turning to face me, his bulk filling the room. My breath hitched. "Done how?" Silas's smirk was a blade's edge, cruel and precise. "The prick who thought he could bleed you? He's gone. Photos are dust. You're in the clear." A shiver raked my spine. "What did you do to him?" "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to," he said, brushing me off like I was dirt on his shoe. "All you need to know is you're safe, for now." "For now?" I whispered, barely audible. He stepped closer, looming over me. "This stays dead, Raven. You don't whisper a word. And don't kid yourself, you owe me deep." I nodded, numb, his words sinking claws into me. I should have felt free, but I was caged, the bars invisible but iron tight. That night, my phone buzzed with a text from him. "Trust me, Raven. This is just the start. We talk tomorrow." I stared at it, the words searing into my brain. Whatever pit I'd fallen into, it was bottomless. Morning came, gray and suffocating. Silas summoned me back to the study, his voice cutting through the phone like a blade. I dragged myself there, each step heavier than the last. He was sprawled in his chair, a king on a throne, eyes glinting with something dark. "Progress," he said, swirling whiskey in his glass. "It's someone you know, someone you let close." My stomach dropped. "Cool." "Not yet," he said, waving me off. "I've got leads. I'll handle it." I nodded, throat tight, mind racing through faces, friends, lovers, ghosts from my past. Who'd sell me out like this? Silas watched me squirm, his calm a taunt. "Don't look so gutted," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I've crushed worse than this. It'll be over soon." His confidence wasn't comfort, it was a threat, a reminder of the power he wielded. Days blurred into a haze of dread. Silas fed me scraps. I'm closing in, he'd say, or won't be long now, his tone always steady, his gaze always piercing. I'd catch him staring, unblinking, like he was peeling me apart layer by layer. Questions got me nowhere. He'd deflect with that same cryptic smirk. One night at dinner, he leaned across the table, voice low. When this is over, it's our secret. Some shit's better left in the dark. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. I nodded, lost for options. By the fourth day, Silas was electric, buzzing with a hunter's thrill. He cornered me in the study, pouring himself a drink and motioning me to sit. Raven, he said, the word heavy, you've been smart about who you trust, yeah? I thought so, I said, cautious, feeling the trap. Good, he replied, eyes boring into me. Trust is a fucking minefield, it's why you're here. But me? You can lean on me. I'll finish this. I wanted to believe him, but his words were a leash, tightening with every syllable. Sleep dodged me again, his voice echoing in my skull. Who was the traitor? What was Silas plotting? Next morning, he was gone again, my mother muttering about business. Midday, a text, getting close. Be ready tonight. Time crawled, my nerves fraying with each hour. When Silas returned, he was a storm barely contained. He dragged me to the study, shutting the door with a thud. It's over, he said, voice a low rumble of triumph. What's over? I asked, pulse racing. The bastard who had you by the throat, he said, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He's done. My blood iced. What did you do? His smirk flickered, faint but chilling. Handled it. Photos are gone. He won't crawl back. Silas, what did you do? I pressed, voice cracking. He laughed, a soft, dark sound. Don't dig, Raven. You're free, that's what matters. Relief should have hit, but it didn't. I was tethered, caught in his web. Later, he called me back to the study, whiskey in hand, shadows dancing across his face. You get it, right? He said, slow and deliberate. This could have broken you. I fixed it. You owe me. I froze. Owe you what? Nothing's free, he said, gaze unyielding. I cleaned your mess. One day, I'll call it in. You'll deliver. My breath snagged. What could you want from me? He leaned back, unreadable. Not now. But when I do, you'll know. I left the room, ice in my veins. Silas had saved me, but at what cost? That night, another text. You chose right, trusting me. We're tied now. More tomorrow. The word tied sank into me like a blade. Days passed, a brittle calm settling in. Silas acted normal, too normal, his composure a mask. But I'd catch his eyes on me, lingering, heavy with intent. One night at dinner, he said, casual as death, you're lucky I've got your back, Raven. His tone was light, but his stare was a vice. Thanks, I forced out, wary. He nodded, satisfied. I've done more than you know. The words hung, loaded and unspoken. I tried to claw my way back to some semblance of normalcy, to stitch together the frayed edges of a life that had once felt mine. But Silas was a specter I couldn't outrun, a shadow stitched to my heels, darkening every corner I turned into. His every word crackled with an unspoken voltage, every glance a tether pulling tighter around a debt I couldn't define, let alone repay. The air in the house grew thick with it, a silent hum of menace that followed me from room to room, seeping into the walls like damp rot. Then one night, he shed the pretense entirely, peeling back the mask to reveal the predator beneath. You've been off lately, he said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the house like a blade through silk. The lights were low, the hum of the refrigerator the only other sound, a faint pulse in the suffocating quiet. I was curled on the couch, a book trembling in my hands, its pages a flimsy shield against the weight of his presence. What's gnawing at you, Raven? Just processing, I lied, my words brittle, chosen as carefully as steps across a field of shattered glass. I kept my eyes on the blurred text, willing my voice to hold steady, but the lie tasted sour, heavy on my tongue. He leaned in, his frame filling the space between us, his eyes, those cold, unyielding pools, locking onto mine with a force that pinned me in place. Talk to me, he said, voice low and insistent, a command wrapped in false warmth. We're tight now, Raven. You can trust me. The words slithered out, heavy with implication, each syllable a brick in the wall he was building around me. His closeness was a physical thing, a weight pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. I forced a smile, thin and brittle as a cracked mirror, and muttered some excuse about needing sleep. I fled to my room, legs unsteady, the door clicking shut behind me like a plea for mercy. But it was a frail barrier, a paper shield against the storm I knew was coming. Silas wasn't done with me. I felt it deep in my marrow, a certainty that pulsed with every beat of my heart. Weeks dragged by, slow and relentless, each day a thread unraveling from the fabric of my sanity. His demeanor shifted, subtle at first, a stare that lingered too long, a word edged with something sharper than before. Then one evening, as the dim glow of the living room lamps cast long shadows across the hardwood, he shattered the quiet with a voice that smoldered like a slow fuse. "I've given you more than anyone ever has," he said, leaning back in the armchair, his bulk dominating the space, his tone a deliberate burn. I shifted on the couch, the leather creaking under me, unease prickling along my spine. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended, a thread about to snap. "I didn't just save you," he said, his eyes glinting like polished steel in the half-light. "I bled for it, Raven. I carved out a piece of myself to pull you from that pit. That's not nothing, it's worth something in return." His words were a hook, sinking deep, dragging me toward an abyss I couldn't see. "I'm grateful," I stammered, the word clumsy, inadequate, slipping out like a plea I didn't mean. I was adrift, grasping for solid ground, but finding only quicksand. "Gratitude's cheap," he snapped, his smirk a jagged slash across his face, cold and knowing. "It's a pretty word that buys you nothing. I'll need more than that, and you'll give it when I call for it." His certainty was a blade, pressed just shy of breaking skin. My skin crawled, 1,000 invisible ants marching beneath it. "What do you want, Silas?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper, dread pooling in my gut like oil. He shrugged, the gesture casual as a killer wiping blood from a knife. "You'll see when the time comes," he said, his tone light but laced with a promise that chilled me to the core. The shift was seismic, a fault line cracking open beneath my feet. One afternoon, with my mother gone again, her absence a void that left me exposed, he cornered me in the study. The room was a cave of dark wood and leather, the air heavy with the scent of old books and his cologne, sharp and invasive. He stepped too close, his bulk a wall that blocked the light from the window, casting me in shadow. "You're dodging me," he said, his voice a low growl, a threat coiled tight. "I'm not," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage too small. The lie was weak, transparent, but it was all I had. "Bullshit," he said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, as if my fear was a game he enjoyed. "You can't run from this, Raven. You're in too deep." I backed up, my hip brushing the edge of the desk, the wood cold against my skin. He followed, relentless, his presence a tide I couldn't escape. "We've got a deal," he pressed, his voice sinking into me like roots into soil. "Don't we? Do we?" I whispered, trembling, my hands clenching into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. His smirk was a wound, raw and deliberate, splitting his face with cruel intent. "Don't play stupid," he said. "You know exactly what I mean." That night, my phone lit up with a text, the screen's glow a harsh intrusion in the dark. "We talk soon. Don't make me chase you." I stared at it, dread pooling in my chest, thick and suffocating, a tide rising to drown me. The next day, he found me in the kitchen, the morning light gray and weak through the window. His mood was deceptively light, a predator toying with prey. "I've been patient," he said, pouring water into a glass, the liquid glinting like blood in the pale sun. "But that's running thin. What do you owe me, Raven?" "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking, a crack splitting through the last of my resolve. "Just tell me." He turned, his eyes cold as winter stone, unyielding. "You feel it, don't you, the bond? You and me, Raven. It's real, deeper than anything else." "No," I choked, tears burning hot behind my eyes, spilling over despite my fight to hold them back. "You're my stepfather, Silas." He laughed, a sound like ice fracturing under weight, sharp and hollow. "That's just a word, a nothing. We're beyond that, two souls who see each other, who get it like no one else can." His intent was bare now, a beast unleashed, pacing free of its cage. "You owe me," he said one night, his voice a low rumble that filled the room, "and it's time to start paying." I tried to reason, desperation clawing at my throat. "This isn't what it was, Silas. I'm thankful, but that's all it is, these gratitude." He leaned in, his eyes blazing, twin fires that scorched through my defenses. "You don't get to dodge this," he said, his breath hot against the air between us. "All I hear are excuses, not the duty you owe." The days that followed were a descent into hell, a slow suffocation under his relentless gaze. Silas was everywhere, his shadow in the hall, his voice in the silence, his presence a noose tightening with every step I took. "I promised to shield you," he said one night, blocking my path to the stairs, his frame a barricade I couldn't breach, but protection's a two-way street. "You've got to give something back." "What do you want from me, Raven?" I snapped, sobbing. "What do you want?" His smile was slow, lethal. "Soon." I was drowning, cornered by a man I'd begged to save me. One night, he sat me down in the study, door locked. "Enough games," he said, voice final. "You're with me, or you're against me." "What does that mean?" I asked, shaking. "Choose," he said, leaning close. "Join me, or face what's coming." "Coming?" I echoed, chest tight. He smirked. "You think I'd let you walk free?" I knew then, I had to act. Silas had me in his grip, and no one could help. But fate twisted. That night, as I hid in the living room, book trembling in my hands, he appeared. "We're talking," he said, voice a command. "No," I said, eyes down. "Raven," he growled, closing in, "stop pretending." "You're wrong," I shot back, steadying myself. "This isn't real." He sat too close, voice softening. "Why fight? We're bound, you and me." His hand reached, then the door crashed open. My mother stood there, face a mask of rage, phone glowing in her hand. "I heard it all," she said, voice steel. Silas bolted up, facade cracking. "This isn't." "Shut it," she snapped. "I've known something was rotting. Now I see it." I froze as she advanced. "You thought I was blind? You used my daughter, Silas. You're finished." He tried to pivot. "It's a mix-up." "No," she cut in, hand raised. "You preyed on her. If you push, I'll bury you. You know I can." Silas faltered, glanced at me, then her, and grabbed his coat. He was gone without a word. I collapsed, tears breaking free, and my mother held me. "Never again," she whispered. "I've got you." Silas vanished after that. My mother and I rebuilt, brick by brick, from his wreckage. I learned strength isn't solitude. It's the ones who stand with you when the dark closes in. I thought I'd feel lighter with Silas gone, like a rope cut loose from my neck, but the air in the house just turned heavy in a different way, empty, brittle, like it might crack if I breathed too hard. Mom tore him out of our lives that night, her voice a steel whip I'd never heard before, her rage a fire that burned him down to nothing. She stood there in the doorway, phone glowing like a weapon in her hand, and I watched him crumble, his mask slipping, his shadow shrinking as he grabbed his coat and vanished. I collapsed into her arms, sobbing until my chest ached, and she held me tight, whispering, "Never again, Raven. I've got you." But even with her strength wrapping around me, I couldn't shake the chill of him, the way his presence clung to me like damp rot in the walls. Those first days after, I drifted through the house like a ghost, my hands trembling around mugs of tea I'd let go cold, my eyes tracing the steam as it twisted up like the secrets I couldn't spit out. Mom moved with purpose, a soldier guarding a broken fort, locks changed, calls made in hushed tones on the porch, her face hard but her hands unsteady when she thought I didn't see. She'd come back inside and say, "It's handled," her voice firm but fraying, and I'd nod, too choked with guilt to ask how she was pulling strings I didn't even know she had. I'd brought this monster here, let him sink his claws into us, and now she was bleeding for it, quietly, in ways I couldn't touch. Sleep wouldn't come easy. Night after night, I'd lie there, tangled in sheets that felt like chains, his voice slithering through my dreams, low, mocking, his smirk a blade cutting through the dark. I'd wake up gasping, heart slamming against my ribs, the room a mess of shadows that wouldn't settle. One morning, Mom found me on the couch, curled into myself, eyes bruised from fighting off the nightmares. She didn't say a word, just sat beside me, her hand warm on my shoulder, and I clung to that touch like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. We tried to stitch something normal back together, piece by jagged piece. She'd bang pots in the kitchen, the sound of fierce cry against the silence he'd left, and I'd sit at the table, forcing down eggs and toast that tasted like ash but kept me here, in the now. We'd talk about nothing, rain, headlines, anything but him, building a shaky bridge over the ruin he'd carved into us. Her strength was my anchor, a light piercing the fog, but I saw her falter too, the way her fingers shook pouring coffee, the way she'd glance at the door like he might storm back through it. I wanted to ask, to dig into the cracks, but I couldn't. I was too afraid of what I'd find. Then the call came, late one night, when the sky was a swollen bruise and the house felt too still, too fragile. My phone buzzed on the counter, a sharp jolt that stopped my breath, and I stared at it, the screen lighting up with a number I didn't know. Mom was upstairs, maybe asleep, and I was alone with the choice, ignore it or face it. My hand shook as I swiped the screen, my voice harassed as I said, "Hello?" A woman's voice slid through, cool and sharp, a knife wrapped in silk. "Shade," she purred, my fake name a taunt. "You thought this was over?" My blood froze, locking me in place, my pulse a wild thud in my ears. "Who are you?" I croaked, but she just laughed, a soft, poisonous sound that tightened around me. "He's not done with you," she said, her words slow, deliberate, sinking into me like stones. "Silas doesn't let go that easy. Watch your back." The line cut out, a sharp snap, and I stood there, clutching the phone, the kitchen spinning as shadows stretched into claws again. I slid to the floor, knees giving out, the warning clawing at me like a splinter I couldn't pull free. I didn't tell Mom, not then, not the next day. She'd fought too hard, and I couldn't drag her back into this hell I'd barely escaped. But it festered, driving me to double-check locks, to peek through blinds at every sound, the city outside alive again, its hum a thread I couldn't shake. A few days later, I found the package, just a plain envelope slipped under the door, no name, no warning. Mom was out, and I stood over it, my heart hammering, knowing I should destroy it, but too weak to walk away. My fingers tore it open, and there it was, a photo of me, laughing in some bar months back, a moment I'd half forgotten. Scrawled across it in black ink, "I see you, Raven. Always will." No signature, but it was him, his arrogance bleeding through the words. I burned it in the sink, watching the flames eat it up, the smoke curling like a ghost of his grip. But the message stuck, a stain I couldn't scrub out. When Mom got home, she found me scouring the sink, my hands raw, and didn't ask. She just pulled me close, her arms a fortress, and I let myself break against her, tears I couldn't hold back. We kept going, building something from the wreckage, meals shared, quiet nights, a life we fought for. Her strength held me up, taught me I didn't have to stand alone. But deep down, I knew Silas wasn't gone, not really. He was out there, a shadow tied to me, a debt I couldn't outrun. Somewhere in the city's neon pulse, he was waiting, patient and hungry, for the day I'd falter again, and I'd feel his claws sink back in.